Hi, and welcome to another episode in our series, Cyber Resilience for Caribbean Leaders. This episode is extremely special as we are joined by Patrick Hayes, a CISO, and author of two books and security strategist. Patrick brings a deep experience across security leadership, incident response, and cyber insurance with a very strong focus on what happens when organizations face a real cyber event. Patrick will be hosted by our CTO, Michelange. Now, Michelange has over 2 decades of building real world defense solutions to help organizations stay resilient. So, we have two cyber resilience gurus in this episode. In the episode, they will dive into the yin and yang of AI with a business cyber resilience context, the importance of data governance, and discuss Patrick's integrated assurance model that offers a very practical approach towards improving your organization control. Now, this episode is a bit lengthy, but I can tell you it will be extremely informative and very business relevant. So, enjoy.
Welcome to our podcast on resilience. Today I'm joined by Patrick Ace. I'm Michel-Ange Zamor from CTO from Stratos Cyber. Pat, before we start, can you just say a couple of words about your background and before we start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Appreciate you having me on, Mikalosh. It's good to see you again. So I've been in the world of information security, cybersecurity for about 30 years now. Started my career working with one of Canada's third largest telecoms, and from there grew out my career as head of information security. Moved into more of a practitioner role where I was an enterprise security architect for a few large insurance, oil and gas companies, and the rest. I've been involved in kind of the tech startup community for quite a long time now, probably about 20 or so years. Moved my family and my business down to the US, and and then over the last number of years, I've picked up and I've taken on writing, and I've published a couple of books. My first book was Integrated Assurance, which was basically the unified risk strategy, which I think it's one of the things that we want to talk about today.
Yep, yep,
And
yep.
and then my follow-up book, which is coming out in July, which is Relevant Impact, which is a field guide to integrated assurance, and basically a practical use guide of. It's really great to have some theory and understand how to combine all of these existing, IT and security and governance frameworks. Now give me some practical examples of how I might be able to use it in a manufacturing company, or in my small, finance startup, or in my healthcare company, or what have you. And that's what Relevant Impact is. It's a field guide on how it's actually been implemented, how I've used it with some of the organizations I've worked with, and some of the customers that I've consulted with over the years. So it's good to see you.
Yes, I'm glad to have you too, and I think we're gonna learn a lot of stuff about those works and learn get from some insight from you. Yeah, so we are honored to discuss one of the most important questions facing enterprise leaders today. How can organization use AI to strengthen cybersecurity without creating new risks and they are not prepared to govern, right? AI, as you know, is already changing a threat detection, SOC operation, fraud prevention, identity protection, risk management, you name it. But it is also expanding attack surface and challenging a traditional governance model and forcing leaders to rethink accountability across a lot of areas: cybersecurity, IT, risks, compliance, audit, and their business themselves, right? So our discussion will explore AI not just as a technology, but as a test of enterprise discipline, assurance, leadership readiness. It's topics that you have, written about, right? So my first question, Pat, your work position cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide assurance challenge, not just as a technical function. So, in that context, how should leaders think about AI in cybersecurity today? Should they see it as a force multiplier, a new threat vector, or both? What would you say?
Well, it's absolutely both. It is a force multiplier for organizations that understand the appropriate use of AI and the boundaries within the areas they should deploy it. But it's also an exponential advantage for attackers and creates an attack surface that I think most organizations are unprepared for. Let's start with the attack surface.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you have organizations that are adopting AI, right, in their workforce for workplace productivity, connecting agents, uploading documents, and using AI as sort of a productivity boost. But you think about attackers and the way that the way that they hone in on organizations. AI dramatically reduces reconnaissance, right? So if I want to learn as an attacker, if I want to learn about your organization, applying AI using agent technology and developing an understanding of your business allows me to run better phishing campaigns. It allows me to create deep fakes. It allows me to evade some of the tactics that you have.
Mm-hmm.
If I start using things like agentic AI or agents, and I gain access, which is quite easy nowadays because most of the time you don't need brute force to gain access to an organization. You just need the password, and oftentimes humans are willing to give that up either through
That's true. That's true.
clicking on something or a stolen session or what have you. And the reality is that once these attackers have agents rolling within your environment, it's very easy for them to gain persistence. It's very easy for these agents to create resources for themselves within your
Mm-hmm.
environment, and then continue to learn about you and your organization. And lateral movement becomes easier. And I was having a conversation with a good colleague the other day where we were talking about advanced persistent threats, APTs, and the old APTs are long gone. Agentic AI has rebranded APTs in a whole brand new way, right? So you think about that, it is a brand new attack surface for most
Yeah.
organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you think about the way that these organizations implement AI,
Mm-hmm.
it's typically not coordinated. It's one group, maybe marketing, maybe sales, maybe a software vendor introduces AI, and you have all of this technology that's deployed that you don't fully understand. You don't understand the ramifications of how this technology can be used in your environment.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
if you think about it from a defense perspective, right? So you asked the question, so how do defenders use AI? And maybe that's a further question, but I think that there's a lot of advantages from a defender perspective for the use of AI, and maybe we can get into that as we kind of roll this out. Because I don't think AI is all bad. I think that there's some really good qualities to it. I think the challenge is that attackers understand it far greater than organizations deploy it.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. So then, to follow up on that strategically, um, if you compare the AI wave to earlier wave of digital transformation, cloud adoption, the internet itself, or automation, so what is so different fundamentally? Is it
Fun.
because the easy
Yeah.
to install agent? What is fundamentally different?
So what is fundamentally different? So let's talk about cloud transformation, for example.
Hmm.
That's an infrastructure change to how the business's IT systems operate and how they work. AI is a trust-based decision infrastructure, right? So when you're moving from, on-prem compute to cloud compute, you're moving a known capability to another known capability that just does it in a little bit of a different way. What
Mm-hmm.
you're doing with AI is you're moving where decisions are made not where infrastructure is. And that's a big delineation, right? So if you have this new technology and capability that is capable of making decisions on behalf of your people and your organization and through your workflows, that's a far greater impact than whether you move to serverless, or you have your cloud computing environment that scales and contracts as your business needs. That's not intelligent, right? Because it's not really making decisions. It's making, it's determining capacity and compute. Whereas AI is actually making decisions on your behalf. Now, trained decisions, which comes with its own problems, but definitely you're not moving infrastructure, you're moving decision making. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm. So that means, if I understand correctly, it's like moving the brain that used to be in your organization outside of your organization so that decision can be made. Is that what you mean, right?
Well, it's enabling faster decision making. The challenge comes in when you look at the two types of decisions that are typically made within an organization or by humans.
Mm-hmm.
There's deterministic, right? Logic and decision making, which is if I do this, then that, right? It's pretty, in the world of security, we know that, right? Like we've written lots of detection rules and correlation rules around if this, then what, right? But when we get into probabilistic, right, where you're actually thinking like a human and you're saying, if I was an analyst, if I was if I was a risk manager, if I was a business executive, I would look at the problem this way, and here are my possible outcomes, right? So you're talking probabilistic logic
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah.
The challenge with probabilistic logic, and when you move that into your decision-making capability with AI, is that first of all, AI likes to please its users, right? So its typical first response will be to try and please you. The second is that it's really only based on the logic that it's been trained with, right? The LLMs it's been trained with is still data. And so when you reach a point, the whole point of AI was to create the capability of coming up with alternate answers
Mm-hmm.
based on a number of probabilities. So let's say that you have 1 in 10 possible answers. 1 through 7 are reasonable. 8 through 10 are wild ass guesses, right? Or completely unreasonable based on what word comes next in the AI's logic. And so now what happens is, 3 times out of 10, you could get, a response that's wildly off based on the next word being selected in that logic,
Yeah.
and not being related to the outcome that you're hoping for. So I think that's really where the challenge lies
Mm-hmm.
is when you're thinking about moving decision making and amplifying decision making or speeding up decision making in deterministic, we've seen tons of gains and it's been super valuable. When you move into probabilistic, that's when you get things like hallucinations or just outright lying, or you get biases or other things that create, significant challenges for organizations that are not just technical. They can also be, public relations or legal issues.
Okay, good, good. Yeah, that's true. So now you just talked about value. Now, um, where do you see AI delivering the most practical cybersecurity value right now? People is using it. So is it on the SOC 3I side, threat detection, fraud prevention, vulnerability management, third-party risk, or somewhere else? Where do you see the value that you just touch on? Where is it a delivery?
So where I'm seeing the immediate value right now
Yeah.
is the ability to turn the flood of triage into valuable verdicts and results, right? So when you think about the traditional organizational SOC, or if you're an MSSP or what have you, that incoming flood of data, at the very top of that funnel, it's, is this real or is this not real?
Mm-hmm.
I won't use the term false positive because I don't really believe that. Is it benign, or is it something that needs to take action? That's the very first step. And if you work through that deterministic logic, typically in a SOC triage process, you can usually get down, hundreds of alerts, thousands of alerts down to just a select few that you actually need to take action on.
Mhm.
Then, if you actually need to make decisions or create verdicts around those around that data that's coming in, you can very quickly create verdicts based on a lot of the rule-based logic that we've created, a lot of the correlation logic that we've created over the years. So it speeds decision making. You can go from, hours, minutes to seconds in terms of doing that. The other area where I think it's been potentially valuable is just the volume and speed of work that AI can help cybersecurity professionals conduct, like vulnerability management, right? So we've heard a lot about Mythos and the introduction of rapid vulnerability discovery. I think that it also introduces a problem in that well, we've been discovering as humans, we've been discovering vulnerabilities for years, and as humans, we've been doing nothing about it for years. So
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
compound that with, 10,000 vulnerabilities, what's a small business going to do with that? They still need to be able to prioritize that and the rest of it. Where I do actually see a lot of the confusion in the market is around, that term of AI SOC and let's just have AI do everything. And I think there's a remarkable difference between AI being used for investigation and fraud detection and things like that versus AI being used to rapidly detect and create outcomes from the data that's coming in. And I think that, if you're a new business that's getting into the space and you're saying, oh, well, I'd like to actually apply more AI to my security operations and my incoming threat data, absolutely focus on the triage and making decisions faster versus doing elegant investigations. Because
Yeah.
as you're doing elegant investigations, the thread is unrolling in your environment. The first thing you need to do is stop it, not look back 3 days later and go, wow, look at how beautiful this investigation was, but it still happened because we didn't do anything about it, right? So that's one of the things that it's a new technology, it's a new capability. Use it properly. Use it to amplify the things that are meaningful to your business.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. So that means using AI for stock triage, vulnerability management, like you
Yeah,
said, yeah, that can bring immediate value. But the AI itself, that doesn't mean the agent, whatever mechanism you use AI to do vulnerability management and the stock triage in itself gonna pose some risk, right?
yeah.
So if you look at the AI-driven cyber risk in itself, what board and executive teams, I think they are still underestimate the risk associated with the AI itself, even though it can deliver value. So what what
Yeah.
what kind of risk do you see they underestimate right now?
Well, in terms of deployment, for example, right, there's guardrails, and I've written pretty extensively about this. Microsoft's got guardrails and AWS has guardrails, and all these organizations have guardrails for the deployment of AI within their environments. The challenge is guardrails is not governance, right? So you have IT or a singular group that's deploying these technologies in isolation of a broader audience, which is the whole
Mm-hmm.
foundation of integrated assurance, right? It's not an IT issue. It's a business risk issue,
Yeah.
right? And when you deploy something new into your environment, you're introducing things that present more holistic risk than just being able to use a technology or as a leaping off point or as an attack vector or what have you. Examples of this are, if you've deployed AI in your marketing group, what's preventing that from being from the data being corrupted or from from messing with the prompts, right? And changing the prompts so that there could be different outcomes, or prompt injection itself, right? And getting the AI to create different results that you're hoping for, and then hallucinations, right? So these are just some very small examples of how I've seen AI go wrong. I think the biggest and most fundamental underlying issue is if you're going to deploy AI, don't use open source, right? First of all, you're exposing your data into an environment that maybe your data doesn't belong in, right? People have
Mhm.
lost their jobs over that, right? I mean, even in the CISA, the people
Yeah.
have lost their jobs. And the reality is, if you're going to expose your data, it all comes down to the data. First of all, if you're going to expose your data, make sure that your model's private. Make sure that you own the model, that the data exists in that model. Then, is the data actually valuable and is it good data? And do you have control over the data that's training your AI models, right? If the data can be poisoned, then it doesn't matter what AI model you have. The outcome is
Mhm.
going to be poor, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the logic that's being used, right? How do you control the prompts that are being used to create the outputs from the data? Is there a mechanism within that that could actually, create outcomes that you're not looking for, or actually gain access to data that, some of the users shouldn't have because you've exposed data that may be confidential or shouldn't be exposed to the users? And then finally, that probabilistic outcome, right? Is AI returning results that I'm hopeful for?
Mm-hmm.
And is it actually factual? Because AI likes to make stuff up. It really does. If it doesn't have data, it'll make the data up. And users, they're not as proficient with understanding that, this fact actually may not be a fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think most organizations, they need to understand that as they deploy these models, traditional governance still applies. It's your data, it's your business processes. And imagine if you had one of your models take all of your data offline or push all of your data outside of your organization. In some scenarios, that would be business crippling or business ending.
Okay, good, good. Yeah. So Pat, talking about governance, because you see the gap here,
Yeah.
does that mean traditional security risk or compliance frameworks, they are not enough, anymore to manage AI related risk? They are not enough anymore. If you take, I don't know, NIST cybersecurity framework, would you use some other AI related framework to manage AI related risks? Do we need that, or do we need to introduce? Because I know you have written about the integrated assurance, so I have a question about that. I don't know. Do we need something else beyond the traditional framework to manage AI risk? What would
So
you say?
I would say the traditional frameworks still matter, right?
Okay,
But they were
but
really,
are they enough?
yeah, they were really built more for static systems and traditional infrastructure, right? Now, having said that, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of framework related standards organizations that are already starting to publish AI directive work, right?
Mm-hmm.
NIST and I've recently worked on the NIST RMF framework for AI, right? The risk management framework for AI. So I believe that I contributed back in December. That framework is out in its early edition right now, and ISO has provided some guidance, and as has other frameworks provided some guidance for the use of AI and the governance of AI. And I think that's good, right? So I also want to be pretty clear about something. So integrated assurance is not a framework, it's a model. It's a model for how you adapt and use other frameworks that already exist. So my objective wasn't to create a whole new framework and start
Okay, okay.
competing in the world, because there's a lot of really great cybersecurity direction, foundational frameworks, and compliance models and so forth. The reality is that organizations either use one or many or in isolation of each other. And I think that's been my biggest challenge. The larger the organization, the more standards and frameworks you're going to find, and the more you're going to find that they don't integrate with each other. They don't speak with each other. It's like I had a friend call me one time. He says, "Hey, listen, I've actually just gone through a risk assessment with my organization, and we're looking for a standard that we can implement for, XYZ. It's an IT standard." And I said, don't create one. What do they use? Do you have ITIL? Are they using COBIT? There are great standards that exist. Just find one that marries with the risk standard that you're using and harmonize them. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the objective. Then you're working with the same language that IT works with, and you're working with the same language that GRC works with and the security team
Okay.
works with. And then you harmonize it at the business level. For smaller organizations, I think, don't get inundated and overwhelmed by frameworks and models that exist in your world. Look at some very, very straightforward and basic stuff like NIST CSF is a good example. There's 12 control categories across 6 or 7 domains. Look at making some of those strides towards better security in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, you're going to encounter a whole new world of regulation that doesn't exist today, and that's called cybersecurity insurance providers. Those insurance underwriters and carriers, they're going to start shaping and dictating what is acceptable risk and not acceptable risk, especially in the world of AI. So you think about it, when you're a large organization, you have, regulatory bodies and government and all the rest of it. But if you're a small organization, you're like, all this framework junk. I
Mm-hmm.
just need to have some security in place. The
Mm-hmm.
reality is that more and more often, cybersecurity insurance is becoming the driver for having the proper controls in place, because essentially what you're doing is you're transferring your risk to a third party that will pay you if you have a breach or a business outage or an interruption, so
Mm-hmm.
that you can potentially recover, right? If they find your risk unacceptable, well, you're going to have to be able to remediate that. So focus on the super important things, right? Your human attack vector, the protection of your data, and some of the common ways of getting there, and stop looking at all the frameworks give you direction, right? There's some really basic security things that you need to do that will protect you. But as you go more and more into the AI space, there are going to be there's going to be some driving forces that will create more framework like regulation, whether it's from insurance providers or whether it's from the frameworks themselves. My goal is to help the companies I'm with navigate that with what exists.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Very, very, very full, very insightful information.
Okay.
So you're right about the integrated assurance part. So what does that look like when applied specifically to AI enable cybersecurity? Uh, what can you tell us about integrated assurance if we want to apply it to AI um, enable
So
cybersecurity?
So I think whenever I talk about integrated assurance, I'm talking about connecting data, decisions, and controls and accountability, right? To business drivers and business outcomes. It's not about it's not about creating more policy, really. It's about making sure that when you deploy something, it's been deployed securely in a fashion that it can't be used in a way that could cause damage to the organization or create an outage or what have you. And whenever you think about integrated assurance, and so you think about assurance, a lot of people think, oh, that's an accounting term, or that's a security term. The
Mm,
reality is it's a business survivability term in my eyes, right? So assurance could mean that you lose your payroll systems for 3 days, 2 days before your payroll needs to run on a Friday, right? That may not have been a cybersecurity incident that created that issue, but it's an incident that creates a lack of assurance within your organization, which leads to a whole number of things that kind of that fall out of place as you go through it, right? So
okay.
when a business lacks a fundamental shared understanding of how things should be running, how systems should be deployed, and what is the business outcome of something not working the way that it should be working. That's what I mean by assurance, and
Okay,
and and
okay,
that's what
I see.
and that's where I provide business guidance around, you know, if you want your systems operating in a fashion that you can count on them all the time, then they need to be deployed based on certain standards, and those standards can be dictated by COBIT or ITIL, or they could be dictated by cloud standards or your AWS standards or your GCP standards. And then
Mm-hmm.
once you have some level of assurance that those things are operating the way that they need to be, then you need to monitor to ensure that they're actually operating that way, that they actually have the proper security controls in place. And that if something isn't right, if you have a security incident or an IT incident, that you have the proper protocols to follow to engage the right stakeholders so that as you go through recovery, you're recovering securely, you're getting back online as quickly as possible to lower the financial impact to your business, and that you understand fundamentally what you did and how to improve it so that your new normal becomes a new normal, right? Not just
Okay.
status quo.
Okay, I see, understand. Now, in this well, not framework, but model, is
Yeah.
there anything to measure AI security governance so that an organization can tell whether his AI governance is mature rather than fragmented, cosmetic, or performative? Is there anything that or how can an organization use this model to measure to tell that? So.
Yeah, I mean, real maturity shows up when something goes wrong, right? When an organization is operating under pressure, obviously that's not the time to learn whether you
Mhm.
have the right controls in place or whether or not AI is doing what it needs to do. I think it comes back to the fundamentals. Um, what data are you using? What are you using it for?
Mhm.
Who has access to it? Do you actually own the AI model or is it an open source model, right? Just a generally available model. And what level of controls are around how people use it? And how do you monitor for whether the output is factual or not, or accurate or not, or what have you? So, the worst thing that could happen is, when you start losing trust, and I have a term that I like to use a lot, which is called trust velocity, right? The loss of trust happens at a much faster pace than the gain of trust. So if you start losing trust with your employees, with your stakeholders, with your customers, with your suppliers, and with the market in general, it becomes incredibly difficult to gain that back.
Mhm.
AI has the capability of amplifying that loss of trust in a velocity that most organizations would find catastrophic, right? So let's say that you have a human breach, right?
Mhm.
Now let's say that it's been amplified by attackers using AI and or agents, right? And instead of having a business email compromise, you have multiple failures as a result of that business email compromise because the attackers' agents are setting up rogue websites on a rolling basis to go and have employees sign up with their 401k data or their
Mhm.
retirement fund data or what have you. And every time it changes and it rolls out to a new unit, let's say you're a global organization and keeps rolling out, but it changes and morphs and changes, right? When you lose trust at that speed, it's super hard to recover from that. So when you think about governance, like I said, the data, who owns the data, and and what guidelines do you have around how that data is used and accessed? Who owns the connections to that data? Who owns the APIs to that data? What partners do you have that have access to your AI environment, to your prompts, or to your environment? I think there's a lot of things that come into play um, from an AI security and assurance standpoint.
Mhm.
And organizations really need to be able to understand when something goes wrong. And it's hard to do that if you don't have a model for what is supposed to go right. It's the same thing as software testing, right? You and I have been in this space for a really long time.
Yeah.
Users will find a workaround if things don't work the way they expect them to do,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
and they'll typically not report it because they want to get their job done, right? So if you can put a square peg in a round hole because the round hole is big enough for the square peg to go in, a user will do it, right? And there's been lots of videos and stuff like that. The reality is that AI creates a lot of those holes and you don't even know where to look sometimes, right? And as soon as an attacker finds that hole, they're going to use it and they're going to use it and they're going to use it and they're going to use it against you, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And whether it's a user that's non-maliciously using it or an attacker maliciously using it, it unravels rapidly with AI versus in a traditional environment.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So in that context, Pat, so how should accountability should be shared in an organization? So how should CISO, CIO, risk leaders, how should they divide the responsibility for AI security in that context?
Well, so I think that flies right in the face of my concept of integrated assurance, right? And developing just additional silos and environments. And I think you've known me long enough to also know that um, you know CISOs, having been one, and yourself being in that space, we're really the custodians. We're the trustees of risk within an organization. Oftentimes, we have all the responsibility, but the lack of authority and possibly all the accountability. I think the reality is that that's a shared risk function across the organization, right? The CISO is really meant to understand, evaluate, and surface risk to the business,
Mm,
provide the business with reasonable responses to that risk, whether it's acceptable, not acceptable, and what we should do about it. Because now you're taking a risk discussion and saying, we have these risks in our environment, we don't have coverage for these risks, and here's what the potential impact of those risks can be. I'm asking for investment of time, energy, or money in order to fix those risks. So it now becomes an investment, a business investment discussion
mm-hmm,
versus a security risk discussion because organizations, I mean, or think about it, organizations are built on risk, taking risks. How do you think some organizations are super successful and some are, some have slow growth or some, don't, or some fail? Being in business is generally about taking risks.
yeah.
So a CISO surfacing this risk to the executive team as a decision-making framework to say, here's where we see the risk as it lies. It has an impact to us legally. So we need to have legal protections in place. And those legal protections will help shape, the proper use of AI. It will cost this much in investment. These are the impacts that it'll have to our brand and the public, and public relations and fallout. Here's the impacts that it might have to our customers and or our future customers if we don't address these things. Here are the impacts that it'll have to our employees. Here's the impacts it might have to our suppliers. See, it now doesn't become a CISO conversation. It becomes an executive team conversation around what risk is acceptable for us to conduct business. And so, not unlike if you were a software company and you wanted to do business in the federal government space, but you were not FedRAMP compliant, you would need to have a conversation at an executive level to say, what are the things that I would need to do to participate in this marketplace that
Mm-hmm,
allows me to be secure enough and meet the regulation and provide the assurance to those customers that I can participate in this market. And then your business needs to make a decision to say, oh, it's going to cost me $2 million to become FedRAMP compliant, but the market is $300 million for us as a company. If we sell into that market, we're definitely going to recover the $2 million that we would have spent on becoming compliant and meeting the security controls. And so now it's not a security conversation, it's security driven because it creates new market opportunity for you. I see AI as being the same thing.
okay.
You're creating new opportunity for your company, for your business, for your organization, but it's also introducing new risk that you've not dealt with before, and
Yeah.
that risk is shared across your business units and across your executive team.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Um, Good. So earlier you talk about trust velocity. Um, well, a question I have regarding that. So, what evidence would convince you that an enterprise is building trustworthy and resilient AI, not simply deploying AI quickly? So, what would convince you?
Well, I mean, everybody's deploying AI quickly. Um, I think um, so. Let me take it back to an analogy from the early e-commerce days, right?
Hmm.
So early in my career, I was presenting to a large group of business owners um, up in some rural place in Canada. And, these folks are like, we're brick and mortar retail stores, right? And
Hmm.
everybody's telling us we need to adopt e-commerce. We need to do it right away. And otherwise, foreigners and people from other markets are going to suddenly be selling to our customers.
Hmm.
And I said, whoa, wait a second. Hold on. Yes, you are a brick and mortar retailer, right? Deploying, like going online, creating an e-commerce store in order to extend your business. Let's think about that. It truly is an extension of your business. It still requires business process thinking, and it still requires an investment in a business division or decision that has an outcome to your company, right?
Yep.
And so you could go start an e-commerce store, but for what market? Selling what things? How would it connect to your existing inventory? Like, there's a whole bunch of complex problems that create themselves from just plopping a store, on Yahoo Stores, right? Yay, now I have a store on Yahoo Stores and I'm
Or
paying 3,000.
Shopify.
Yeah, and I'm paying $3,000 a month and I've sold one product. And I've had none of my existing customers churn because I was scared that other retailers were going to, sell into my market, not thinking about all the logistics and all the other things. AI is no different, right?
Okay.
When you think about it that way. Why are you deploying AI? So, first of all, what is the business reason for why you're deploying AI? Great. What are the measurable outcomes that you're expecting from that AI when you deploy it? Now, I'm not saying security stuff here,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
Business
it yeah, but
decision.
it does feed the governance model. Is it doing what we are expecting it to do? If it's not doing what we're expecting it to do, then what is it doing? And is it having a measurable positive impact on the business? If it's not, how much are we investing versus how much we're getting from this? I think a lot of organizations are starting to come to that realization right now that, wow, I saved a whole bunch of money on staffing and on, rapid time to business and processing and all that stuff. But they're also understanding, like they did with when they put all their stuff in the cloud and went, wow, look at my AWS bill. Now they're saying, wow, look at the usage credits that I need to pay for these AI models. And wow, look at these bad decisions that we've had to unwound, or look at this poor software that we vibe coded into our environment. So it's not unlike anything else in the assurance world, right? As security practitioners, what is the reason for you doing it? How does it support the business? What are the outcomes that don't support the business, or what are the impacts to the business when it doesn't perform properly? And then how do we monitor for those things when they occur? How do we monitor for hallucinations? How do we monitor for prompt injection? How do we monitor for data poisoning? How do we monitor for shadow AI, right? And
Yeah.
for data leakage and things like that. I think that's how you actually have to look at the deployment of AI. There's a lot of great uses within organizations. There's a lot of great use cases that produce, positive business impact. But if not done properly without proper monitoring and governance, those things can unwind very quickly. Like I said, losing trust in this space. Imagine you have a chatbot out there that allows for a user to buy a car for you for $2,000, a $70,000 car. That's a real live situation that happened because
Hmm.
a user challenged a chatbot into providing them with, a great price on the car, and they had to follow through with it. I mean, I think Air Canada went through the same situation with one of their chatbots where a user manipulated the outcome of the chatbot because they couldn't predict what the AI model was going to do. when the user wanted train the AI model to please the user, right? So there's a lot about AI that I think as businesses we don't fully understand. And I think if we look to just the technologists to help us understand what that is, that's the wrong place to look, right? There's a lot more to this than just how does the technology work. This isn't a relational database anymore, right? This is a thing that can make determinations based on lots of data.
So yeah, so with AI, we have different questions, but we needed to hold on governance, business, sound, questions, that will align with a business objectives. We'll still have to hold on that. Now, in terms of board oversight, what should board be asking about AI? That they often fail to ask today, So obvious question, I don't know. So in your practice, what have you seen?
The one obvious question that I never hear. I have never heard this one question until I've introduced it into the discussion. What could go wrong? I always hear how much
The
can we
threat
save?
modeling.
Yeah, I always hear how much can we save? I always hear when can we reduce staff? I always hear when do we see the sales gains? I always hear how fast can we release code to market? But I never hear, well, but what could go wrong,
The
right?
questions around threat modeling. That's what. Okay. Very good.
Absolutely. Because I think so there's two things, right? And I don't want to throw this, I don't want to throw this at board members because I've been a board member. The reality is that when you ask a tough question, you start to learn the answers. And when you start to learn the answers as a board member or a director of a company, you start gaining more accountability for answering those questions, right? What could go wrong? And I'm not saying that, no, we don't want plausible deniability. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is there's already a lot of risk within organizations. Introducing AI rapidly, all that does is amplify that risk significantly. So yes, you're seeing the positivity gains, and you're seeing that most of the negative fallout is headcount reductions or impacts to staffing or change to work and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that it changes customer supplier relationships. It changes B2B relationships. It changes B2C relationships. I just recently did a presentation to the broadcast industry where, I said, you can adopt these cloud models in these cloud frameworks, but you also need to understand that as you do that, and as you take on some of the AI modeling that can be done in these spaces, you also have a responsibility as a broadcaster to the general public that you're broadcasting in good faith, accurate information. And if
Yeah.
there's a possibility that this could be, taken over by deep fakes or used against the general public or create false news or things like that, you have a responsibility to know when those things can happen, detect them and stop them from happening so that they don't become not just an incident for your organization, but could become a catastrophic community incident, right? I used to work a lot with oil companies, and I was a security architect for a large oil company. And, one of the things that we used to say is that, we have 150 field sites that are pumping oil, extracting oil out of the ground. And if we lose visibility to those field sites, then, we could be killing people, we could be causing a natural disaster, or we could be losing money, or all three of those things. And let me tell you, not in that order, right? That's absolutely, that's not the order that the executive are thinking from, the board are thinking from. They're thinking, I'm losing $100 million a day because I don't see what my field sites are doing. I think the reality is we need to apply that same level that same level of importance around how we're utilizing AI, right? And that is, how is it being used? And is it beneficial? And as a board member, what could go wrong? Because if something can go wrong, there is a chance that it could go wrong because it does. right?
Yeah.
Humans are still somewhat involved, right?
So beyond these threat modeling questions, um, leaders try to scale AI in their environment, but what other practical advice you would give them before they do that, before they scale the AI beyond the threat modeling? Is there any other advice that you would recommend to them?
Yeah, human in the loop, right? I think a lot of times as you develop these models and you deploy these models within your environment, you need to be constantly testing the output is what you're expecting it to be, and having some human testing in the loop, or human outcomes in the loop, or human evaluation in the loop is an effective way to. I mean, humans are not perfect either, but the reality is that humans still think like humans. They still have a less likely poor outcome when they're faced with 1 in 10 decisions to make, and 3 can be bad, 7 can be pretty good, right? Humans will typically fall within the 7 range almost, more frequently. Let's say, at least not the kind of the cockamamie space where it's like, oh, this one's just completely ridiculous, but I'm going to do it because, it's one of the options.
Yeah,
So
that.
I think having humans in the loop and having some sort of audit of whether your AI models are actually working the way that they should be working before you broadly deploy them across all aspects. And I think the other thing is deterministic logic, and I've said this before, that is prime time, right? Those are the spaces that I would look to deploy AI to get efficiencies and productivity gains and process improvements and all the rest of that. Probabilistic is, we're still a ways off from that. And so what you're doing is you're introducing risk that you didn't have a method to measure for before. And
Mhm.
so if there's no method to measure it, if there's no way of understanding, a poor outcome, maybe hold off on deploying into those spaces, because it's just going to introduce risk that you're unfamiliar with, and you're not going to have a way to measure a negative outcome until it's already too late.
Okay, good, good. Yeah, that's very important. So I see time is really passing very quickly by. So let me ask you my last closing questions, Pat. So
Sure.
if an enterprise leader listening to this episode today wants to move from AI experimentation to a more responsible AI adoption, so what are the three things they should do in the next 90 days? What would you say? Three
Well,
things.
I I think they need to think of a use case where the applicability of AI is
Hmm.
going to have a direct impact on their business, right?
Okay.
Um, and I think it's something that the business knows, understands, follows, right? So first of all, I would pick an isolated use case that you can measure, that you has a predictable outcome,
Hmm.
has an outcome that can be determined by a set of rules. The second is I would absolutely put guardrails around how the implementation of AI is rolled out in your environment. What I mean specifically is the data. So first of all, make sure that the data actually represents what you want the data to represent in the decision-making process, right?
Hmm.
If you start with bad data, if there's the ability for the data to become bad or be I don't want to use the term poison, because poison's not always the way it happens, because data can become poor just because of poor classification or people, manipulating the data in ways that you didn't intend. So make sure that you're starting with good data, and it's data that will actually drive the decisions that you're expecting. And then I would say measure and monitor that, and have the ability to fall back on your traditional business processes. Here's the one where I think a lot of small businesses really fall down is they start implementing process gains. And I've seen this not just with AI, I've seen this throughout my career. They implement process gains, and then the system fails,
Hmm.
and then they have no manual processes to fall back on because they've been using integrated systems for so long that they're making it up again, right? It's like, early in my career, you remember Lotus Domino? Maybe I'm talking about something that's too old for the average person, but Lotus Domino was a great database for building workflow. And then SharePoint entered the market, right? Microsoft and SharePoint. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of smaller companies went, wow, SharePoint is, looks cooler, it's cheaper, it comes with my, enterprise licensing, and this Domino thing is just expensive to manage and all the rest of it. And they started migrating over to SharePoint. But they forgot that SharePoint didn't have process automation. There was no workflow.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a database with no workflow, which was, Domino's clear strength. I wasn't a fan of Domino, but it had really strong workflow. Think about that now in the context of AI, right? If you can model a current business process and amplify it to either do it at greater volume or faster or more efficiently or have better decisions made faster and outcomes that come faster, like I said in the AI SOC, right? If I can get to verdicts faster than a human would, that's a fantastic use case. And if I can monitor to make sure that those decisions are being made based on logic that makes sense
Mm-hmm.
and that there's no hallucinations or whatever, that's a really great business case. Saves you money, it saves you time and efficiency, and it helps you actually detect and block attackers faster, right? So there's business outcome that you can measure against. But if you start if you start implementing it, so from a security standpoint, let's say that you start implementing it into your investigations, well, so you might be able to add more enrichment and you might be able to pull in more sources and you might be able to do more complex investigations.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that you detected that launched that investigation, it may have already deployed malware. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You could have stopped it at the point that made the determination as opposed to launching this long, elegant investigation into it, right? So just make sure that the use case has a business outcome that makes sense to you as a company, right? If you can apply it to marketing and have marketing create better collateral, better output, all the rest of it, and you can validate that what it's saying is not irresponsible or lies or misleading to the public, you've got a great use case. As a business, that rapidly reduces the amount of time that it takes to produce marketing material based on a set of content that you have as an organization. But again, make sure that it's not misleading. Make sure that it's not creating legal liability issues for you
Mm-hmm.
because again, you'll go to your insurer and say, "Hey, I have an errors and omissions policy and general liability for something like this." And customers come back and said, "I have this," and you go, "Okay, but you were basically lying. Like your literature is misleading.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you were purposefully misleading. Whether the AI did it or you did it, you're responsible for the outcome." So again, none of this has to do with technology. This all has to do with responsible business decisions, right? Being a responsible business. Um, and that's, I mean, really, that's just all there is to it.
So, but thank you very much for
Yeah.
sharing your insight and so what stand out from this conversation is that AI can be really a powerful tool for strengthening cybersecurity, like you put it for SOC triage, vulnerability management, but only when it is supported by strong governance, clear accountability, and operational discipline. And I will not forget to mention your integrated assurance. So for enterprise leaders, the message is clear, right? AI will not fix weak governance, I would say. It will expose it, right? And the organization that succeed will be those that treat AI not only as a technology opportunity, like you put it, but as more as a leadership risk and assurance priority. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent.
It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it was super great catching up with you again. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah.
Hi, if this episode brought any value to you, we kindly ask you share it with others. If you need help on your cyber resilience journey, you can find us on www.stratos-cyber.com. Until we meet again, keep well.